When people hear medieval universities, they are usually going to picture one of the two bad images. The first is the romantic one: ancient stone buildings, the scholars in the robes, the candlelit rooms, the old books, the solemn wisdom, the noble beginning of higher learning. The second is the contemptuous one: the dry old church schools, stale authority, blind repetition, and the lack of freedom. No real freedom, no real originality. Just people reciting and accepting the same truths over and over and over again, until the Renaissance comes along and supposedly wakes Europe up. Both of these pictures miss what is actually interesting about the medieval universities. What is actually interesting is that the medieval universities were among the first places in Latin Christendom where disagreement was turned into an institution. Not invented, obviously. Humans have always been arguing with each other. But what they did is they shaped, they trained, they formalized, and even gave a recognized place inside of education itself to disagreement, to debate. And that is a much bigger achievement than it first sounds like. The medieval university, it did not create thought from nothing, and it did not create modern liberty in the way the later myths sometimes suggest. What it did do was help create a culture in which argument became a disciplined method for approaching truth, for approaching debate. And that matters enormously, because civilizations do not only depend on what they believe, they're also dependent on how they handle contradiction. They depend on what they do when you have the clash of authorities, when texts seem inconsistent, when one argument sounds persuasive and another one sounds very persuasive too, when inherited truths need to be clarified rather than, just merely repeated. I think a weak intellectual culture either panics at contradiction or suppresses it. A strong one develops forms for working through it. Medieval universities at their best were places where Europe learned to do that. So if we're going to talk about medieval universities and the birth of debate, we have to start by clearing away one bad assumption, and that is that the Middle Ages were intellectually dead until modernity arrived. That view is not just simplistic, it completely understands the kind of intelligence that medieval institutions were trying to cultivate. I think medieval universities were not trying to produce rebels for the sake of rebellion. They were not trying to produce detached skeptics floating above all commitment. They were trying to produce trained minds capable of reading carefully, arguing precisely, distinguishing concepts, resolving objections, and thinking within a structured view of reality. And that's different from modern academic culture in some ways, but it's not inferior in the childish sense that, some people might imply. In some areas, I think it was actually more demanding, because the medieval university assumes something that a lot of people today are not sure they can believe anymore. That truth is real, that contradiction matters, and that the human mind can be trained to approach difficult questions through ordered argument rather than through impulse, or identity or mere assertion. That is the real beginning of the story. Now, where do the universities come from? Let's get into the history of this a bit. Let me look at my notes here. They don't appear out of nowhere. The medieval universities grow out of earlier institutions of learning that existed in Europe. The cathedral schools, the monastic schools, and the local teaching traditions of Europe. Europe already had places where people learned grammar, rhetoric, logic, the scriptures, law, and theology. But over time, especially from the 11th and 12th centuries onward, something new begins to happen. Schools become more specialized, more urban, more international, and more organized. Teachers attract students from multiple regions. Certain cities that are not necessarily on the map become major centers of study. Intellectual life becomes less purely local at that point, and gradually institutions emerge that aren't just schools anymore in the loose sense, but corporate bodies of masters and students with recognized rights, structures, privileges, and identities. And this is what the medieval university is at its core. It's a corporate intellectual body, not, just a curriculum or the building, but a body. And the point is important because the word university in the medieval setting does not initially mean a place with classes and dorms in the way that we might think of it now. It means a recognized community, an organized body, kind of like a guild in some ways, if you know what guilds are. In some places, this body was now more centered on masters, and others more strongly on students. But across the board, the principle was the same. A university is an institution that can teach, regulate, discipline, negotiate, and preserve itself. It has legal standing. It can define membership of itself. It can claim privileges. It can say, in effect, we are a real corporate force in this society. And this all turns out to matter a lot for the history of debate. Because once you have learning becoming institutionalized, argument and debate is no longer the private habit of unusually sharp individuals. It becomes reproducible. It can be taught generation after generation. It can be attached to offices, degrees, examinations, faculties, and careers. Debate becomes a lot more structured and less accidental. Now, the two early models that are very classic are obviously Bologna and Paris. And the difference between them already tells you a lot about the range of the medieval intellectual life. Bologna becomes famous above all for its law, the civil law, the canon law, just the legal interpretation of everything. And if you think about it, law is one of the most naturally argumentative fields imaginable. Law lives on distinctions. It lives on interpretation. It lives on the question of what a text means, how a rule applies, how one case differs from another, and how authority should be ranked, how procedures ought to work. A legal culture almost automatically trains people in structured disputation because you cannot do law seriously without argument. Paris, by contrast, becomes the great theological center, though theology there rests on, the broader education of the arts faculty. And that makes perfect sense. Theology in the medieval world is not simply pious feeling or this devotional repetition. It is the disciplined attempt to understand revealed truth as fully as possible. So it has to address, questions, objections, the tensions, the heresies, all the philosophical challenges and the clarifications that come up or so. So theology, too, becomes a highly argumentative discipline, perhaps maybe the most ambitious of all, because what it's trying to do is to think systematically about God, creation, morality, salvation, in the structure of reality itself. And there are other centers, Oxford, for example. Later on, it becomes an enormous force in its own right, but the pattern remains the same. The university itself becomes a place where knowledge is not just handed down. It's worked through. That phrase, worked through, we should come back to it, because the usual lazy stereotype is that the medieval scholar simply accepted authority and then stopped thinking. But that's not how real intellectual life works. And it's not how the university worked either. Medieval scholars, they absolutely respected authority, whatever it may be, the scriptures, the councils, the major philosophers, the church fathers, the legal texts, the commentators, etc. But respect for authority did not remove the need for argument. In a strange way, I actually think it increased it. Because once you inherit many authorities, you also inherit their tensions. Augustine says that one thing in a place of another, and another thing is somewhere else. Aristotle appears to suggest a conclusion that raises theological difficulties. A legal canon seems to conflict with another legal canon. A philosophical proposition sounds rationally compelling, but its implications appear dangerous. A biblical text seems straightforward until it meets another biblical text. And now what do? If you're there in the university, you can't just say, well, I think truth is impossible. You can't just say to stop asking questions. If you believe truth is coherent, then the contradiction itself becomes a task. This is exactly the world the medieval university enters. It enters and takes itself into a civilization already rich with inherited texts, and it asks, how can a trained mind, how should a trained mind move through them? And the answer that develops is not, shut up and obey, nor is it whatever you believe you find interesting. The answer is this method. That is where scholasticism comes in. And people hear that word and they're either, I feel like, intimidated or bored. But the basic idea, I think, is very clear. Scholasticism is a style of thought that tries to organize difficult questions through rigorous argument. Careful distinctions, structured engagement with authority. It is not only one doctrine. It is not, one philosopher. And it's not even a school, a narrow school in the small sense. It's a broad intellectual method that dominated much of medieval university life. And what makes it so important is that it builds conflict into the search for clarity. I think that's the real breakthrough. A scholastic text doesn't begin by saying, here's the truth, memorize it. It begins rather with a question, then come objections, then a statement from the other side, then the author's own response, and then replies to each objection. The structure, what it does is it trains the reader to inhabit the argument. You are forced to see why someone might think otherwise. You're forced to confront the strongest case against the conclusion. You're forced to move carefully through it, and you can't leap straight to certainty. That is a culture of debate, and honestly, it's a more serious one than a lot of people today are used to. Because right now, in many contexts, I think I just see this online. Debate means performance. It means winning points. Sounding clever, humiliating an opponent, or going viral, or signaling allegiance, or just overwhelming another person with rhetoric. The medieval disputation was not free of ego, obviously. Human beings are human beings. I think that's fundamental to human nature. But its ideal was different. The ideal was disciplined confrontation with a question, not just conflict, but it was ordered conflict, not opinion, but reasoning under rules. And I think that's why disputation matters so much. The medieval disputation was one of the core teaching methods of the university. A question would be posed, arguments would be offered, objections would be raised. replies would be made. A master might preside and eventually determine the issues. Students learned not, just what to think, but how to move through a difficult problem. The disputation, it taught listening, memory, logical sequence, conceptual clarity, and the art of answering a position rather than evading it. And think about what that means educationally for a moment. It means that the student is not simply absorbing content. He is being formed into an intellectual combatant of a very particular kind, not a brawler, not a man of rhetoric in the empty sense, but he becomes a trained thinker who knows that every claim has to survive objection. That's a huge strength. That's a huge trait. That's a huge civilizational habit. And it is one of the reasons that medieval universities matter far beyond their own time. They help normalize the idea that serious knowledge must be defensible. It can't just be asserted or inherited or emotionally satisfying. It has to be defensible. Now, I should pause here, because medieval universities were not environments without authority. I think in some ways they were saturated with authority. But that is exactly why their development of debate is so impressive. Because one thing to argue in a world where nobody recognizes anything above themselves, that can produce energy. But it's also producing chaos and shallowness. And it's another thing to argue in a world where major authorities are already in place and still insist that reason has work to do. Medieval universities belong to the second kind of world. They assume that truth exists, that God exists, that revelation exists, that all of this inherited wisdom matters, and that the text still deserve reverence. And they're still arguing. I think that's important. It means they don't see questioning as necessarily hostile to truth. They see it as a part of how truth becomes clearer to finite minds. That's a very high view of reason, even if it's not a reason detached from faith. And I think once you understand that, the whole stereotype of the medieval university starts to collapse. These are not dead institutions preserving dead ideas. They are active engines of interpretation. They're trying to train people to think under conditions of complexity. They're putting them under pressure, immense pressure that I don't think we see today. Now, let's get back into the history for a moment here. The students, what do they actually study? The lower and broader foundation was often the arts faculty, which taught, the liberal arts, which was just grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. But if you're looking for the intellectual center of gravity in terms of debate, logic matters especially. Dialectic or logical disputation becomes one of the core tools of serious study. The students learn how arguments work, where they fail, how the terms shift, how conclusions follow or do not follow, how ambiguity can mislead, how contradiction can be formal rather than something substantive, how the distinctions can rescue a position that can initially look absurd. And that sounds technical, and it is, but technical training is exactly what makes intellectual culture durable. I think a civilization grows when it teaches its people not just information, but procedures for handling information. Then after the arts, a student might move into a higher faculty, law, medicine, or theology. Each of these fields deepens the culture of debate in its own way. I think law what it did is it sharpened textual analysis, procedure, the hierarchy of authority, and case reasoning. Medicine, it trained observation, it inherited doctrine, and the reconciliation of theory with practice. Theology, above all, became the crown of scholastic inquiry because it dealt with the largest questions and demanded the highest synthesis. And theology is where the university's argumentative culture, collective in a way, becomes most visible in its mature form. Because theology in the university world, it's not simply sermons. It's systemic thinking. If God is rational, creation has order, revelation is true, and human reasoning is a gift, then theology must do more than, preach or proclaim. It must distinguish, explain, resolve, and defend. It has to answer heretics. It has to be able to respond to philosophers. It has to recognize doctrine. It has to help preachers and bishops and councils to think more carefully. And that's why the great theological works of the medieval world are so full of questions and objections. They're not just rambling on about whatever. They're not rambling meditations. They act instead as engines of ordered reasoning. And we get to one of the most important figures in the whole story. Not because he invented everything, but because he shows the method at its highest power. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas is often remembered in a weirdly flattened way, I think, as some sort of giant authority figure with he was some official church thinker whose job was to close questions. But if you actually read his style, what is striking is how much of it is built on talking objections seriously and facing them head on. He's not stating his view alone. He's staging the problem. He lets the other side speak. He tries to understand the force of counter-arguments. And this is the university method doing exactly what it was built to do. And Aquinas isn't alone in this. The point is not, to worship this one guy. The point is that the intellectual environment of the university made this kind of work possible. A thinker could assume an audience trained to follow distinctions, objections, counterpositions, and resolution. That is what an institution does when it matures. It creates the kind of reader, listener, and student necessary for advanced thought. This is one of the most underrated things institutions ever do. They're not just protecting the ideas, they create the kind of mind that can receive and extend them. Let's talk about Aristotle now, because you can't understand the medieval university without understanding the shock and power of his arrival in the Latin and intellectual world. As some of Aristotle's works became more available in Latin translation, either through the Arab and Greek transmission, European scholars suddenly had access to a much larger philosophical toolkit. They had logic, metaphysics, natural philosophy, ethics. This was not a trivial addition. It was an expansion of the thinkable. Aristotle gave the schools a more systematic vocabulary for discussing causation, substance, motion, knowledge, reasoning, and the structure of the world. That did not make medieval scholars into pagans, or imitators of the Greeks. I think it did the opposite, actually. It intensified the need for debate. Because Aristotle was useful, but he was also dangerous in certain ways, or at least difficult. His claims could sharpen tensions. If his natural philosophy suggested one thing, and inherited theological assumptions seemed to suggest another, the scholars had to work harder. If his account of reason, matter or eternity raised problems, those problems could not simply be waved away. The university had to learn how to engage them. So the arrival of Aristotle does not end medieval Christian thought. It forces it to become more exact. And that, again, is a major civilizational gain. A culture gets stronger when it encounters an intellectual challenge and chooses not merely to suppress it or surrender to it, but to think through it carefully. And that is what the medieval university repeatedly tried to do. But I'm going to be honest, there were limits, and this matters. The medieval university was not a modern, free thought paradise. Certain doctrines were fixed. Certain claims were forbidden. The heresy was not treated as some sort of harmless, experimentation or whatever. The university existed within a larger Christian order, and that order expected it to remain, in the end, within acceptable bounds. But here is what makes universities so historically important. It's that even within those bounds, it cultivated real argumentative vitality. In fact, it created the very existence of boundaries, intensified the sophistication of debate, because it forced the scholars, it forced them to learn how to argue carefully. They couldn't survive by being vague. They had to know what could be said, what was being implied, what distinctions mattered, and how to formulate a conclusion in a way that actually answered the problem without collapsing into error. Now, that kind of environment can be restrictive, yes, but it can also produce an astonishing level of precision, and the university did that. Think about the skill that comes from living in a world where a sloppy formulation can create theological disaster, legal confusion, or public scandal. People become sharper. They pay attention to words. They distinguish senses. They ask not just whether something is true, but in what way, under what conditions, in what respect, according to what definition. I think that's the training of thought. And if you want proof that these universities were intellectually alive, just look at how much conflict they generated. There were condemnations, disputes, rival schools, these famous debates, controversies over Aristotle, over faith and reason, over universals, over the powers of God, over law, over poverty, over church authority, over natural philosophy. Dead institutions, they do not produce that much energy. Dead institutions do not keep needing to define their own boundaries. What medieval universities created was not a consensus in the shallow sense. What they did is they created a structured field of contest. That, I think, may be their deepest contribution, because one of the hardest things for a civilization to do is to create spaces where disagreement does not automatically become destruction. Either disagreement gets treated as treason or it dissolves into endless noise. The medieval university, it tried to build a third possibility, formal disagreement under a shared set of rules. This is so much closer to the foundation of real intellectual life than I think most people realize. And this is where the birth of debate becomes it's not just an educational story, but it becomes a political and civilizational one. Because the habits trained in universities, they're not just staying there, they move outwards. The law courts benefit from the minds trained in distinction and reply. The church councils benefited from the minds trained in text and objections. The royal administrators benefit from the literate, organized, the analytical clerics and lawyers. Even the preachers benefit from the minds trained to anticipate misunderstanding. And even the later critics of scholasticism are shaped by the world it built. You do not get later humanists or reformers, critics, and anti-scholastics in the form we know them, without the intellectual infrastructure of scholastic culture. That is one of history's recurring patterns. A movement becomes so central that even its enemies think in terms it helped establish. Now, there is another side to this too, and it is worth exploring because it gets to something almost spiritual. The university taught people that it is possible to submit to truth without submitting to intellectual laziness. And I think that's a very powerful idea. In a lot of weak cultures, those two things get really confused. People think that if truth is fixed, there is no point in inquiry. Or they think that if inquiry is real, then, the truth must be unstable. The medieval university, in a way, rejected both assumptions. It said, truth may be stable, but your understanding is not complete. It said authority may be real, but authority does not eliminate the need for thought. It said inherited wisdom may be profound, but finite minds still need to clarify, compare, reconcile, and defend. And that combination, that the confidence in truth with some seriousness about inquiry is rare. Harder than people think. Easier either to collapse into skepticism or to collapse into repetition. And the university tried its best to hold these together. And that is why debate matters so much here. Debate is not just a social activity. It is a way of acknowledging that the human mind often reaches truth through difficulty, through opposition, through correction, through embarrassment, through being forced to answer something it would rather ignore. The scholastic culture of the university institutionalized that process. It built forms in which people had to face objections and not merely hide from them. That is one reason the greatest medieval writings feel alive even now. They often know the opposing case better than the modern, the modern superficial writers know their own position. And that's what serious argument does. It humbles assertion. And I think that is one of the hidden reasons this topic still matters now. We live in a time where disagreement is everywhere. So everywhere. Everywhere you go, there's disagreement. But debate itself is often weak. People react constantly, but they do not always argue well. They speak with confidence, but they're not defining terms. They're not considering objections or understanding the positions that they're attacking. A lot of modern discourse, it's very emotionally saturated, but intellectually thin. And the medieval university, for all of its distance from us, it reminds us that debate becomes worthy only when it is disciplined. It reminds us that not every contradiction deserves a panic. Not every objection is destruction. Not every authority is inherently oppressive. And not every challenge is liberation. What matters is whether a culture can form people capable of staying with the question long enough for clarity to emerge. That is what these universities tried to do. Now, there was also a social dimension to this. Students and masters, they lived in close, often contentious communities. These universities had internal politics. They had their own nations, faculties, rivalries, privileges, dispute with the townspeople, conflicts with bishops, negotiations with kings. University life itself was argumentative. It was corporate, it was political, and often unruly. So debate was not only in the classroom, it was embedded in the institutional experience. Students learned to belong to structured bodies, to elect representatives in some cases, to navigate rules, to appeal, to petition, and to even resist local authority when necessary. So the university formed not only out of intellectual habits, but civic ones, not democratic in the modern mass sense, but corporate and procedural. People learned that institutions could govern conflict without abolishing it. That may be one of the great hidden transformations of medieval Europe. A civilization becomes more resilient when it develops institutions that can process disagreement. That is true intellectualism. It is also true politically. And the medieval university did it both in its own way. And I'm not saying, romanticize it too much. I think medieval universities were, often narrow, very clerical, socially restricted, and obviously, deeply established to the powers that be. The access was limited, the freedom was very bounded, and the curriculum could become rigid. There's a million critiques. The technicalities could, be very excessive. The arguments could be detached from reality. There were obviously real limitations, but the historical seriousness doesn't mean confusing these limitations and meaning we should nullify the meaning of the university. The fact that an institution is not modern does not mean it's unimportant. The fact that it had boundaries does not mean it lacked vitality. The fact that it was rooted in authority does not mean it could not produce argument. In fact, the real genius of the medieval university may be precisely that it found a way to make argument flourish inside of an inherited order. That is stronger than chaos. It's stronger than rebellion. It's stronger and harder than raw originality. It requires patience. It requires memory, discipline, and trust that truth can survive scrutiny. So if we ask what medieval universities actually gave Europe, I think the answer is something like this. They gave Europe institutions where thought became formalized. They gave it methods for handling contradiction without intellectual collapse. They gave it a culture in which objections had to be heard and answered. They gave it trained minds for law, theology, administration, philosophy. They gave it an international learned community of speaking a common language, that common language being debate itself. They gave Europe the habit of treating questions as things to be worked through rather than merely feared. And in doing so, they helped create one of the permanent features of Western intellectual life, the idea that truth is approached by forcing thought to pass through difficulty in an ordered way. That is the birth of debate in the medieval university. Not the invention of speech, not the invention of disagreement, not the beginning of all thought. Something more specific and, in a way, more lasting. The creation of institutions where argument became a discipline, where contradiction became a teacher, and where a civilization learned how to make thinking reproducible. That is why these universities matter. Because they helped teach Europe how to think with structure. And once a civilization learns that, it changes everything that comes after.